Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us today to this co-sponsored event by the Cuban Observatory and the Center for Latin American Studies at Stanford University. My name is Jesus Urbano Gonzalez and I am a master's student in the Latin American Studies program here at Stanford University. Today I have the great pleasure of introducing Dr. Mikael Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe holds a PhD in Latin American history from the University of Chicago, a master's in international history with a major in East Asia and a minor in Middle East from the University of Chicago, and a bachelor's in East Asian Studies from Columbia University. Dr. Mikael Wolfe is an associate professor of history at Stanford University, where he teaches Latin American history, U.S.-Latin American relations, environmental history, and climate change, ethics, and geopolitics. His research focuses on the intersections of social, political, environmental, and technological change in revolutionary Mexico and Cuba. In his scholarship and teaching, he employs the interdisciplinary historical methods to explore questions of water control, agrarian reform, and the effects of climate and weather on the process of social revolution. Dr. Wolfe teaches both undergraduate and graduate courses in modern Latin American history, historiography and film, history of U.S.-Latin American relations, comparative history of modern Latin America and East Asia, environmental history of Latin America and the United States, climate ethics, and water history. His 2017 Duke Press book, Watering the Revolution, An Environmental and Technological History of Agrarian Reform in Mexico, won the Eleanor K. Melville Prize for Latin American Environmental History and received the Maria Elena Martinez Prize for Mexican History. Dr. Wolfe has also published several articles on the environmental, technological, and climate history of Mexico and Cuba. And without further ado, please welcome Dr. Mikael Wolfe.
Thank you, Jesus, for that kind introduction. My book did not actually receive the Maria Elena Prize. It was shortlisted for it. So I don't want to take that away from the actual winner of the prize. So thank you all for coming, and for those of you watching through the live stream. I know this is right before Thanksgiving break, so I appreciate you making the effort to come out here. So as you can see from my visuals here on my first slide, what I'm going to do today is first to show you that there is something called embargo denialism, that is the U.S. embargo on Cuba, and that there's a broad sort of discourse in the United States, both politically and even academically, that denies and downplays, dismisses the impact, the very severe impact of the embargo and blockade on Cuba, the Cuban economy, and the Cuban population. And I've been thinking about this for quite a long time. As you heard from the introduction, I also teach courses in climate change ethics, and one of the first things that we talk about, of course, is climate change denialism. That's probably something you're quite familiar with, denying that climate change is real, right, or that it's dangerous, or that it's something that we really need to do anything about. This has been a coordinated, a very deliberate campaign to sow doubt in the science, and it's been going on for decades. It has been fully documented. It's comes straight out of the playbook of various companies, from fossil fuel companies, also tobacco companies, and so forth. And so what I want to show is that the denial toward the embargo and the blockade works very similarly to that of climate change. And people I think, are not as aware of this, partly because Cuba, to the extent that it makes it into mainstream media coverage, is often described in ways as if the embargo doesn't really exist or doesn't have much of an impact, or it's just Cuban propaganda, right? Cuban state propaganda. So the first picture here, you might say, well, what is that? That's the UN General Assembly vote that just took place on November 3rd. What was this vote about? It was Cuba bringing, for the 31st or 32nd time, to the world community its complaint about the blockade and embargo against it. 187 countries voted in favor of it. The vast majority of the world, in one of the only democratic bodies on the world stage, 2 voted against it. United States, obviously it's not going to vote against its own policy. The other country is Israel. We can talk about why that is. Of course, Israel's been in the headlines lately, you might know. And 1 abstention, that is Ukraine. Ukraine has had some issues with Cuba because of its both past and present relationship with Russia. But overall, as you can see, this is an overwhelming rejection of this policy, right? Now, I don't know if my student Jessica Anna Feminayas is here. No, maybe she's on the live stream. So she's done quite a lot of research for me about coverage of Cuba in the US mainstream media. And so she did a quick look at a number of publications, mostly on the liberal side of the spectrum, a couple on the conservative. Not a single mention of this vote. Not one mention of this vote. In the Washington Post, in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Fox, NPR, you name it. The only one that she found was an AP and Reuters. Now, if you know anything about AP and Reuters, they're just news wires, right? They're stringers who write something, and then other news medias can pick it up and take the text and then integrate it into their own news coverage. So the fact that it appears in AP and Reuters is not very significant, right? Because it doesn't actually get much dissemination. You know, if it doesn't make it into the New York Times or some other news coverage. So, I mean, I just want you to think about that for a second. That a major vote on a major policy of the United States towards another country does not get a mention in any US media outlet, practically. What would we say if a vote like this came up, and it has, about Russia's policy toward Ukraine, or China's policy toward Taiwan, or any number of countries that are so-called official enemies or rivals that are doing something similar to another country? Be front page news, right? There'd be a lot more attention toward it, not almost a complete blackout. And this is very typical about news coverage of Cuba and the U.S. embargo on it. And so, you know, I'm going to make that argument that this is a form of denialism. You know, it's denialism through silence. And I'm going to show this through various slides. And I'm also going to show that the impact of the embargo is devastating, it is real, and is completely unlawful. And I also want to show that, you know, as I said before, it works very similarly to climate change denialism, but they're actually linked because climate change is something that is affecting Cuba in very serious ways. You can imagine, it's an island nation, right? And it actually has a very innovative program to adapt to climate change, possibly unique in the world. Also something we will know virtually nothing about in the United States because it's almost never covered, and that's called Tarea Vida, Life Task. Unfortunately, I can't get as much into Life Task, but there's an excellent documentary about it, which I'm going to show a few clips from, called Life Task, by my good colleague, Dr. Helen Yaffe, based in Scotland, who went to Cuba and interviewed a whole bunch of people involved in it. And it's about a 15-minute documentary, really worth seeing, all free on YouTube. She made it purposely accessible like that. Now, this, of course, this title, The Climate Change Hoax, Pathway to Socialism, this is an egregious, I'm using like the most, right, sensationalist kind of denialism. You know, I don't think anybody would call the embargo an actual hoax, even the hardline Cuban Miami community. They'll say, yeah, it's real. What they'll deny is the effects of it. They say, there's not really much of an effect of it, you know, and I'm going to get into this in a moment. Now, one thing about climate change denialism, oftentimes it's not even really about the science. A lot of the deniers and so-called skeptics, they don't get the science right at all. I mean, you can just see that in what they say. And if you go to the peer-reviewed literature, I mean, it's nonsense what they say. What they're really afraid of is that doing something about climate change will somehow lead the United States into socialism, right? That somehow doing that will mean a takeover of the economy by the government and so on and so forth. So that's, you see, pathway to socialism. So I thought it was interesting to use that because, of course, Cuba is officially a socialist country, right? Now, in reality, it's not nearly as socialist as it used to be, something I'm also going to talk about, which also has consequences on frankly, the absurdity that this embargo continues. 61 years after it was imposed, back at a very different time during the Cold War, right? Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to sort of link all of these, and I'm going to start, you know, I'm a historian, so I got to start a little bit with some historical background, not too much. You know, this isn't a history lecture. there are plenty of great books in Cuban history. Ada Ferrer just came out with a Pulitzer Prize winning history called Cuba, an American Story. Luis Perez Jr. also has a great primer on Cuban history from Reform to Revolution. So I'm just going to highlight a few things that I think are important. Subjective, I admit, very subjective on my part. The first, to understand is that the United States has always had its eyes on Cuba. It's a neighboring island nation right off the coast of Florida, strategically very important, as it was to the Spanish Empire. Right? And John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State in April 1823, now this was at a time when much of Latin America, across the Americas, actually the term Latin America wasn't coined yet, as my master's students know now, right? That didn't come for another few decades. But, if we're going to use it anachronistically, Latin America at this time, most of it was now independent, right? Had broken off from Spain. Cuba was an exception. The elites of Cuba chose to remain with Spain, and largely because they were afraid of slave rebellion. That just happened in Haiti, and a lot of Haitian sugar planters, or I should say French sugar planters in Haiti, moved over to Cuba, joined that elite in Cuba, and they decided, we better stick with Spain if we don't want our enslaved people to take over here. That is not the only reason, but that one is one of the major reasons. So Cuban independence, as I'm going to show in a second, didn't come until a lot later. But anyway, this metaphor that John Quincy Adams used about Cuba being an apple that ultimately will be ripe for the United States to pick is one that stayed in the American imagination for a very long time. And I would argue still in some way informs U.S. policy toward Cuba. Although, you don't necessarily hear Cuba as an apple, right, that we need to pick back or something like that, right? But so here's the famous phrase from John Quincy Adams: if an apple served by the tempest from its native tree cannot choose but fall to the ground, Cuba, forcibly disjoined from its own unnatural connection with Spain and incapable of self-support, can gravitate only towards the North American Union, which by the same law of nature cannot cast her off from its bosom. Right? So it's a law of nature somehow that eventually it's going to become part of the North American Union, part of the United States. So there was very strong annexationist sentiment at the time, but basically the United States wasn't capable of doing it yet. It wasn't strong enough, right? It had to compete with the European powers. And you might know the same year the Monroe Doctrine was forged, right? Saying, Europe, keep out of the hemisphere, right? Even though it was toothless because the US could not actually do that. And the history, French, British, Spanish still intervened in the Americas for decades on end, right? But it was a statement of intent, saying, beware, we are eventually going to be powerful enough to do this. And Cuba figured very, very prominently in this geostrategic vision. So here's a visual right on the eve of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Puck magazine published in New York. Here's the Cuban apple is ripe, ready to pick for the United States. Uncle Sam's looking up at it, along with other apples, Puerto Rico, Philippines, so on and so forth, and putting it into the basket there. And it says, patient waiters are no losers, right? The United States was patient. It waited, 3/4 of a century to be able to do this finally. And that occasion came with the Cuban War of Independence, the third one, in fact, over 30 years. This one was the bloodiest one, and the one during which Cuban forces actually were able to nearly defeat the Spanish. But before that could happen, the United States intervened and kept the Cuban insurgents out from taking power, and then basically set up a de facto protectorate over Cuba. Not a full annexation, not a full colony as such, but a kind of protectorate, a domination of the country through economic means mostly. But if you have questions about that later, there's a lot more to say about it, the Platt Amendment, so on and so forth. But suffice it to say that, from about 1902, when the United States occupies Cuba and regularly intervenes in the country's affairs, to about 1959, it's fair to say that the U.S. dominated the country, right, economically. It's not to say Cubans didn't have agency. It's not to say that there wasn't a degree of autonomy, and so on and so forth. But for the most part, I think even scholars who debate this will say yes, the U.S. was the main player in Cuban affairs, and certainly so economically. That all changed with the Cuban Revolution of 1959. Right? You all know about Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, right? Now, they weren't the only ones that made the revolution happen by any means, but that's not something I can get into today. They are the ones who were the face of the revolution. They took it over after 1959, and that put them on a collision course with the United States almost immediately, because they had a radical social agenda, social reform agenda. Changes in landed property, land reform, nationalization of properties, of energy, for instance, redistribution of wealth, all sorts of policies that the United States did not take kindly to, had already been overthrowing governments for doing this, Guatemala, for instance, in 1954. In some ways, when we look back on it, it's almost inevitable that there was going to be this clash between the Cuban Revolution and the United States. And through a series of back and forths involving mostly the nationalization of U.S. property, but also Castro's determination for self-determination, saying we will have our own independent foreign policy, and that means we're going to have relationships with the Soviet Union. You have to remember this is the Cold War. That's also a no-no for the United States, right? So within just 3 years of the revolution, you basically have a severing of diplomatic relations and a full-scale economic embargo imposed on the country. In 1962, that was by JFK, although Eisenhower, the Republican, had started it. So very bipartisan, whether Democrat or Republican, right? Now, it's not just the blockade, right? Even though that's the main policy, right, that I'm talking about to this day, and that's the main one that Cuba really objects to and the entire world does. There are also, of course, the proxy invasion of the Bay of Pigs, I'm sure you've heard about, in 1961, that failed. And then there was also terror and sabotage operations, blowing things up, whether it was ships, industrial plants, poisoning crops. I interviewed a lot of people in Cuba, older people who have memories of this, of U.S. Cuban exile planes coming over, flying over and trying to, poison crops or bomb facilities and that sort of thing. What we call terrorism today, right? You don't have to take my word for it. You can just go to the CIA Freedom of Information website, look up these documents. They're all there hiding in plain sight, but almost never used in the U.S. media. You can find document after document, talking about these raids and these sabotage operations. But unfortunately, they're not very much used and not very well known. Now, to focus mostly on the embargo and the blockade, however, I think we need some definition of terms, right? Now, in the United States, it's known as an embargo. Right? If you go to Cuba, they call it a blockade, right? And these terms become very politicized. On social media, which I got off of Twitter, X, whatever it's called now, months ago, it was getting a little too much for me. I mean, my use of even blockade was objected to. Like, that's what the Cuban government uses. And I'm like, well, what's your objection to it? The Cuban government uses. Can you tell me why? Why is it wrong? Can you give me a definition? No, I didn't get an answer for that. So I'm going to give you mine. An embargo is one country suspending economic relations with another country, but it doesn't necessarily affect other countries' relations with the embargoed country. Right? It's a bilateral measure, right? I don't like what you're doing. I'm going to stop trading with you. Right? Is that what the U.S. embargo on Cuba is? Well, a blockade, usually used in military or naval terms, right, means one country controlling by force what can be imported or exported from another country. So you've all been probably following the news, at least to some extent, about what's happening in Gaza, right? Well, for the last 16 years, Israel, along with the US and Egypt, have actually really blockaded Gaza because they control, Israel mostly, what can go in and out of Gaza, right? And that's through military means. So the U.S. does not militarily prevent Cuba, right, from trading with other countries. It doesn't do that. It did do it. It did do it for 10 days or so during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, but since it has not done that. What it does do, however, it uses economic, financial, and diplomatic pressure through extraterritorial laws, regulations, and other means that very, very clearly violate international law. Right? It's that extraterritoriality component which I think is behind the overwhelming rejection of this policy in the global community. Because if you take a look at who voted in favor of the condemnation of the U.S. blockade, take a look. Conservative U.S. allies, Britain, France, Germany, Japan, neo-fascist Italy. I mean, the most right-wing governments absolutely hate this policy because they don't want to be told they cannot trade with some other country. So you have your issues with Cuba, don't make it our issue, right? Let us, if we want to trade with Cuba, if we want to invest in Cuba, that's our business, right? But that's not what the blockade or embargo, I'll be using these terms interchangeably, all right? That's not what it is, because there are all sorts of regulations and laws that really do try to prevent other countries, other companies based in foreign countries from doing any kind of business in Cuba. And that is completely against international law and the UN Charter. Now, another thing pushback I often get is like, well, okay, U.S. policy isn't good, but it's both sides, isn't it? I mean, Cuba doesn't act very well either. I'm going to get to that issue in a moment, but let's just dispense with this. It is not a both sides issue, okay? It's absolutely not a both sides issue. This is an extremely asymmetrical relationship. For one thing, Cuba has a $50 billion GDP, maybe $100 billion. We don't quite know. The World Bank claims $100 billion. A good colleague of mine in Cuba, who's looked at this very carefully, believes because of the currency reforms and so forth, that amount is actually probably closer to 50 billion. Whether it's 50 or 100 billion, the US has a $24 trillion economy, right? Cuba's a little speck if you take a look at, the two countries economically side by side. But I think just as importantly, Cuba has not sanctioned the United States. There are no sanctions that Cuba imposes on the United States. Not that it could, right? But it doesn't. It's never tried to overthrow the U.S. government, like the United States has who knows how many times, right? And still is. That's still official policy of regime change right now of the United States towards Cuba. Cuba has never done that. And plus, it's a double standard because the U.S. does not impose sanctions on authoritarian human rights violators. El Salvador right now is a human rights disaster. Its draconian crackdown on gangs is arresting thousands of people who are rotting in jail, oftentimes detained without charge, without proper trial. I mean, take a look at Amnesty International. It's up in arms over what's happening in El Salvador. And the leader, Bukele, actually calls himself the coolest dictator. He's proud of being authoritarian, right? Barely a peep out of the United States for this. A little bit here and there. They express their concern, right? And most of the concern is not even about that. It's more about his use of Bitcoin, right, for the economy. Right? Same ditto. Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Uzbekistan. I could go on and on and on. And most of these countries actually are far worse human rights violators than Cuba. You take a look at the human rights reports and the kind of nature of the violations, right? These countries are far worse than Cuba. All of them, not only do not have trade sanctions against them, but receive U.S. aid, military, economic aid. Right? Egypt in particular, $1.2 billion in U.S. military aid every year. A horrible human rights violator. And also at the center of the Senator Menendez scandal, the hardline Cuban American senator in New Jersey, who was caught basically taking bribes from Egypt because of his senior role on the Foreign Relations Committee. And Egypt wanted to make sure they could keep getting this $1.2 billion U.S. military aid. So they bribed him, basically. And he took the bribes. He's accused of it, and he refuses to resign. Almost every Democrat wants him to resign. But he's keeping on. Now, he turns around and says Cuba is a human rights violator, is corrupt, is mismanaged. I mean, the hypocrisy is just extraordinary, right? I mean, it's just breathless. So that's what I want to lay out, about embargo versus blockade, although you'll probably hear me kind of use them interchangeably. This, I think, is actually really, it's from a children's story, The Lion and the Mouse, about a lion catching a mouse, right? Well, you can probably imagine what my metaphor is about, right? This is the U.S., that's Cuba. I think this is a clearer depiction of the relationship here. The lion puts its paw on the mouse, on its tail in particular. It can't move anywhere. It gets tangled up, right? And the lion says to the mouse, "Why are you getting all tangled up? You should know to get untangled and move this way or that way or that way." And the mouse says, "Can you take your paw off my tail?" No, we won't take our paw off your tail. Yeah. That's essentially, in a nutshell, I think, is what's going on between the two countries. Now, in this actual story, I just reread it last couple of days. The lion actually does let go of the mouse because the mouse convinces the lion that the mouse can do something for the lion later on. And the mouse does, because when the lion is trapped by a hunter, the mouse is able to gnaw its way and let go of the net, right? Unfortunately, we're not there yet when it comes to the Cuban-U.S. relationship. Okay, so how does the embargo blockade denial actually resemble climate change denial? So here I'm going to give some more details about this. So about a decade ago, even liberal media in the United States would often accord a tiny minority of climate scientists skeptical of anthropogenic climate change, right, the same attention as the vast majority proving it is real and dangerous. This included even like the New York Times, the Washington Post. There are a lot of studies, really good media studies about this. And this came from a fundamental misunderstanding of how science works. Science works by consensus. Right? You have an experiment, you have your hypothesis, you test it, you publish your results, others review it, replicate it, and then you have a growing body of evidence that supports a particular hypothesis or what have you. And that consensus has been growing since the 1970s on climate change. The number of climate scientists who actually are skeptical of this can be counted on your hands. The vast majority, now I think it's 99.9% say it's absolutely real, it's getting worse, it's dangerous, and we got to act. It's long overdue that we're not acting on this. Yet, the liberal media would present this as if there are some scientists who say it's happening, others who say, there's not really enough evidence. And so it gave this impression of a debate, right, between two equal sides. That's fundamentally inaccurate and misleading, right? And unfortunately, this kind of coverage persisted for a very long time. Now, fortunately, the liberal media has stopped this. Basically, now if you read an article in a liberal media outlet, they will say right away, they won't even entertain that climate change is not happening, right, or is not human caused. Right? Now, the conservative media, however, they still continue with this, right? The result is that the U.S. population falsely believes to this day that the science is unsettled and still debated. Fortunately, that percentage has been coming down over the years. Right? But there's still a substantial number, like a quarter or something like that actually still believe that the science is unsettled and still debated. I think it's very clear why this is the case. It's because of the way the media was covering the issue for so long. And the fact that so many people still get their media from, Fox, others that still, pervade this kind of false symmetry, false belief, right? So what about the U.S. embargo blockade on Cuba? What impact does similar media coverage have on politicians and academics? The thing with the embargo, as I was saying before, is that there hasn't been a course correction, right, on the part of even the liberal media. Right? They will still report on Cuba's economic problems as if the embargo has virtually nothing to do with it, or is just, the Cuban government says this, right? But they don't independently verify it, right, for themselves. And I've done, in my my good student, Jessica Van Nuys, have done a lot of good media research. We've gone through hundreds of articles. We don't really look at TV reports, but we assume that they're probably pretty similar, right? So, as I said before, there's the denial through silence, right? Silence, right? So, again, virtually no U.S. media coverage of this recent General Assembly vote. And so these are the phrases that I frequently read and hear from not only politicians, journalists, and the media, but from my fellow academics. And I'm going to say this, they should know better, right? The Cuban Revolution government is a colossal failure due to extreme scarcity of consumer goods, inflation, crumbling infrastructure, and massive outmigration. Okay. Causality? Is it linked to anything? No mention, right, of U.S. embargo. The embargo is just an excuse for the government's failures. The embargo doesn't exist in practice. This was a doozy. I mean, I was like, oh my God, does not exist in practice? Now that is pure denialism, right? But these are phrases that I typically hear, and they're repeated over and over again, and therefore they are talking points, basically. They're talking points, wittingly or unwittingly. They're a form of denial, and they essentially serve the agenda of a hardline lobby against, Cuba, normalization of relations with Cuba. Now, if you want proof, go to the archive. I'm a historian. There's so many declassified documents. Here's the main one that set up the policy, 1960. Right? This is someone in the State Department. I can't quite remember who it is. The decline and fall of Castro. First, the majority of Cubans support Castro. There's no effective political opposition. Castro and other members of the Cuban government espouse or condone communist influence. Communist influence is pervading the government and the body politic at an amazingly fast rate. Militant opposition to Castro from without Cuba would only serve his and the communist cause. Right? 6, the only foreseeable means of alienating internal support is through disenchantment and disaffection based on economic dissatisfaction and hardship. And it gets more cynical. If such a policy is adopted, it should be the result of a positive decision which would call forth a line of action which, while as adroit and inconspicuous as possible, makes the greatest inroads in denying money and supplies to Cuba, to decrease monetary and real wages, to bring about hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government. This policy has not changed in 61 years. Or actually, this was 1960, so this was before the full embargo was imposed. But already the first sanctions were imposed. Essentially, this has not changed. This is still operative policy to this day, I think. Because I cannot understand why Biden will not go back to Obama's policy of more, rapprochement, which happened for about 2 years before Trump then was elected. And not only reversed Obama's policy, but imposed even tighter sanctions on Cuba. Really stifling, crippling sanctions that are really wreaking havoc in the country. So this couldn't be clearer, And these kinds of memos, if you look in the record, just keep coming up over and over again. The record dries up, I think, somewhere around 2009, but I can't imagine they're any different, and certainly not during Trump's presidency. Now, my good graduate student, Christian Robles-Baez, who's much better with numbers than I am, he's an economic historian, he put together the actual impact of the blockade on Cuba's economy, and this is based on figures that the Economic Commission for Latin America, very well respected in terms of economic data for all of Latin America, they presented this to the United Nations for the 25th vote or so on this issue, and basically said, from about 1960 to 2018, it's cost Cuba about $130 billion. And he calculated in 2012 prices, the net loss at minus 118 billion. You have the population number, the cost per capita, the net loss in percentage of GDP, and this would be 2018 if if the World Bank is correct and it's a 100 billion economy. This would be for 50 billion, so minus 236%, right? Just of GDP taken away from Cuba, by the embargo, right? Let's compare that to the worst economic crisis to hit the United States in its history, the Great Depression of 1929 to 1933. Pretty bad in the US, but look, minus 26%, right? Now, granted, this is over the space of 4 years, whereas the other one is over the space of 50 or more years. So it's not exact. I'm sure any economist around here is going to gripe about my use of numbers. We will refine this a bit more, but clearly this is absolutely devastating impact. I mean, and this is not coming from a cyclical economic recession that turns into a depression, right? No country was imposing this on the United States. There was the Soviet Union. Soviet Union wasn't doing this to the United States, right? This happened because of cyclical factors and so on and so forth. You can read about what happened with the Great Depression. This one on the right is all because of the policy of an external power, right? And this is only through 2018. This doesn't include the last 5 years when the embargo, the blockade, has been tightened even more by Donald Trump, right? Clearly, this is undeniable. You just can't, to deny this is really to defy reality in some way, right? Now, I actually think this is kind of an exercise I decided to do when I was thinking about, all my work over the years on climate denial, climate ethics. I thought, does it actually, if you look at the numbers and the charts, does it actually resemble the climate? Like what climate change actually does to our normal climate, the way that the U.S. embargo does to the Cuban economy? And I found this interesting. So if you look at the temperature record, instrumental from 1880, before that we have to rely on things like ice cores and so forth. But the instrumental record since 1880, clearly shows a variation, right? Temperatures always vary. They always have, for millennia, millions of years and so forth. But they vary within a pretty bounded range, right? Now what anthropogenic climate change has done, as you all know, is to push that range out of a historical norm. Right? Now the variations are completely outside of what they used to be, and how human civilization has flourished. This is why climate change is so dangerous, because it's putting us way outside of these normal ranges of temperatures and therefore all sorts of the impacts that we're seeing, in terms of intensified hurricanes and droughts and wildfires and so forth, right? I would think no one in this room and anybody watching would necessarily object to what I'm saying. This is pretty well-established science. Now, this is where I'm sure I'll get some pushback, but this is my hypothesis. The impact of the embargo economically on Cuba resembles climate change impact on global temperatures, right? So this is not actual data about the embargo. I'm only using exactly what you saw in the previous slide, putting it here. I don't actually have the numbers. I haven't looked at the numbers. What I'm guessing is that if you could quantify things like corruption, mismanagement, inefficiencies, right, all the things that people claim Cuba, for doing and for why it has an economic crisis, right? Well, it's their own fault. They're inefficient. They mismanage. They're corrupt, so on and so forth, right? Now, the first thing to say is, tell me what country does not have corruption. Tell me what country does not have mismanagement or inefficiencies or something. I mean, take a look at neighboring Haiti, Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Honduras, Guatemala, Mexico. Are you telling me you haven't seen corruption in those countries? I mean, inefficiencies, mismanagement, right? So, for that matter, the United States, right? So, sure, it's more or less depending on whether, there's more corruption or less in any given country, right? But it stays within a bound because they're not sanctioned. They can still trade freely, right, with the United States, their main trading partner. Unfortunately, all the cases I'm talking about, right? And so for Cuba, obviously the U.S. period, this was the case. Now, there's a blip right after the revolution because the U.S. imposes, right, this blockade, and so things get bad. But then the Soviet Union comes in with generous subsidies and trade benefits and so on and so forth. So that cushions the blow of the blockade for several decades, not entirely by any means. We can get into that later. But then once the Soviet Union collapses around 1991, then the effects of the blockade go completely out of any kind of normal range, right? So that, sure, there's corruption in Cuba. Sure, there's mismanagement of resources. Sure, there's inefficiencies. But with the sanctions in place like that, it exacerbates all of these things. There's no room for error. There's no margin for error, right? Any little thing that happens, you roll out a currency reform, and it doesn't go well. It affects the entire economy. A hurricane hits, blows out part of the power plants. It affects the entire country. The embargo makes it extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible, to recover from it, right? That's what it does. And so, for blockaded Cuba, this goes into an abnormal range. Now, for climate, there's actually something called attribution science, and that's being done right here at Stanford. Meaning they can measure the impact of anthropogenic climate change on any single weather event now. So a wildfire, that happens all the time here in California, they can actually say climate change made this 30% worse, or 50% more likely, or what have you, or this hurricane, or that, or the other. And so they basically revolutionized our understanding, because it used to be, you can't attribute any single weather event to climate change. It just loads the dice, right? It just makes it more likely. No, actually now you can attribute and even see the percentage, the precise percentage that might be for climate change. So we do not have normal weather anymore. We don't. Even just light rain that's going on outside is now being changed in some way by climate change, right? So my hypothesis is it works very similarly. A road doesn't get built in Cuba. A hospital doesn't have power. You name it, the effects of the embargo. If we had attribution science, we could probably attribute some percentage of those problems to the embargo, because it's so pervasive over the country, right? Well, we don't have that. At least I don't know of any. If you do know of one, please let me know. I don't think we have that. And I don't think anybody will probably do it because it's just not a sexy enough topic. Right? Climate change is huge, it affects the whole world, so I understand why we have attribution science, right? But it'd be useful because there are other sanctioned countries too. Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, Syria, North Korea. US sanctions so many countries in the world. And so I think economists now are actually trying to do this a bit more, especially with regard to migration. They've argued, I think quite convincingly, you put sanctions on a country like this, you're going to increase migration out of the country. You're going to force people to leave, right? They're not going to overthrow the government. They're going to leave. They don't have the weapons to overthrow the government. If they're starving, like that memo said, right? Well, what are they going to do? I mean, it's very few and far between in my study of revolution that starving people actually lead the revolution. It's not starving people who do it. Right? It's people who are angry about the inequalities and who have means. And then organize and create the revolution, right? So it's completely wrong-headed tactically, never mind even morally, right? To think that, and the main effect really is to just encourage people to migrate, and that's what's been happening in Cuba. Hundreds of thousands of people have just been leaving the country in droves because the inflation is out of control, the salaries are so low. The infrastructure is crumbling. There's electricity outages all the time. Especially the youth, they see no future, right, in their country. Of course, the embargo cannot explain all of it, right? But it explains a lot of it for sure. And if there were more research about this, we could know. Maybe we could come up with a percentage, And I would venture to say it's a very high percentage. Right? All right. So I'm going to just end this now with just a few videos. One of them I made. I traveled over the country over the last year doing research on a historical topic from the 1960s. But I also decided, Cuba is always a contemporary issue between the United States and Cuba. So, I was very fortunate to be invited into this family's home in the city of Bayamo in Granma province in the eastern part of the country. Very poor region, historically sugar producing. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, its sugar industry just basically collapsed with it. And it's never been able to recover from that. It has no real tourism to speak of. It has no other product that really generates the same kind of revenue. Some rice, some shrimp, but nothing like sugar was for this province. It's also much more mixed race than the western part of the country. And so, this family who I befriended, who let me into their home, and they let me, see how they live. And this was just as I arrived. They were trying to make a meal for me, very nicely. They got meat, something that's pretty hard to find and afford. But I'm a guest, right? Because if you know Cuba, you go. The culture is extremely welcoming. People will do anything they can for you, right, to welcome you, no matter how modest their means, right? The power goes out, and they're really angry about that. And so, but they want to cook the meal for me, so they got to use Kindle. They don't have their electric stove, so they use Kindle. So this is Kilo, and he is telling me what is going on, right? I'm sorry, I don't have subtitles for this, but I'm sure most of you understand Spanish, and I can certainly translate afterwards.
Tres.
Bueno, estamos cocinando aquí a Mikael porque es que no tenemos fluido eléctrico. Pasamos mucho trabajo con el fluido aquí y tenemos que cocinar en leña para poder alimentarnos y alimentar a los niños. Aquí no hay mucho. Dicen, es que no hay combustible. Para la planta, ¿cómo le dicen? La termoeléctrica no tiene combustible. Y entonces tenemos que utilizar la leña.
¿Y qué están cocinando?
Vamos a cocinar carne. Vamos a cocinar carne de rey. Carne de rey. Lobar.
He's a very good cook, by the way. He's really good. Now, I don't know if so he's basically saying, we don't have electric current right now. And they say there's not enough fuel, right? So do you see his skepticism, right? I totally understand that. The government is supposed to provide you with electricity. It's not happening, right? He is very poor, as you can see. He works for the public sector in public health. During the pandemic, he gave people COVID shots. By the way, Cuba vaccinated more of its population than any other country in Latin America with its own homemade vaccines. Right? This is despite the blockade. When he's not doing that, he also fumigates for dengue, and this is all part of public health. So he works for the state sector, right? And that is where the crisis is felt mostly, right? Not in the burgeoning private sector nearly as much. And I understand his frustration. Absolutely, you have intermittent electricity. And they keep saying there's not enough fuel for the plants. Cuba has a very antiquated energy system. It requires a lot of oil to run, and Cuba only really has heavy crude oil, so it's very hard to refine. And so that makes it even more difficult to keep the energy system going. Now, what the blockade does is make it really difficult to get the spare parts they need to fix the plants and to maintain them. European companies would be happy to do it, but it's too costly for them, in part because of the blockade. They're afraid of getting sued, right, by the laws that the United States, has passed about it. So it leaves really only Russia, China, Venezuela to do this, right? Now you can imagine Venezuela is not doing great. Russia is not exactly in a position since it invaded Ukraine. China does help, but it doesn't want to bankroll Cuba the way that the Soviet Union did. Right? So there aren't many places to turn to. Cuba obviously can't do it themselves. They don't have the infrastructural capacity. Right? Now, but so I understand where Kilo's coming from. Right? Remember that memo, inconspicuously, right? To try to do it in a way, right, that people aren't aware of where this is coming from, right? What makes it so difficult? Now, what I will say is that, the Cuban government obviously has to prioritize where energy goes. It has to triage. So where do you think the energy goes? Is it going to go to Granma province that has nothing really to offer in terms of tourism, alternatives to sugar now? No, it's not going to go to Granma province. It's going to go to Havana. It's going to go to the tourist sites. Now, of course, we can be critical of that. Cubans gripe about it all the time if you go there. The thing is, where else are you going to generate the revenue for your economy? Again, look at any other country. They are going to prioritize sectors that produce revenue, right? And then with that revenue, they provide social services and they build infrastructure and so on and so forth. The embargo makes this so much harder, right? I don't know exactly how much harder, but I would say manifold, right? But again, there is a legitimate critique to say, why do they neglect a region like this? If you go to Havana, you don't have nearly as many blackouts. That's not fair, definitely. But again, that's not unique to Cuba. Go to Mexico. The southeast is neglected compared to the center and the north. Go to Brazil. The northeast is neglected compared to other areas in the country. The American South has long been neglected, right? So the thing is, why single Cuba out for this? And then impose an embargo that makes it even worse, right? It makes no sense, right? Now, ironically, there's another sector of the population I was just mentioning that is very aware of the U.S. sanctions and have very strong ideas about it, and actually speak very differently about the sanctions than Kilo does. Now, to be fair, I didn't actually ask Kilo directly about U.S. sanctions. I just sort of let him speak and to see what he would say about the energy crisis. So this is a different kind of video. Belly of the Beast. Some of you were at the documentary screening a week ago. It's the same company that does this, tries to do alternative media about Cuba. So they went into a business conference being held in Havana, and they interviewed some people there. Is this going to work, Sarah? Oh, right, yeah. Thanks. F3, yes. Could you help me out? Sorry, I can't get to the... Yeah.
Doing business in Cuba arrest, one that several U.S. and foreign business people attending Havana's International Business Fair this week are willing to take.
Cuba es un mercado muy importante para la industria avícola de Estados Unidos, está entre los primeros 5 destinos más importantes para exportar pollo.
The service we provide is from 3 ports in the United States. We're now completing 22 years of operation.
A lot of the products that Cuba is needing is in mid-United States. And we're going to be doing shipping and partials from Louisiana here to Cuba.
More than 9,000 micro, small, and medium-sized businesses have been created in Cuba since changes to Cuban law in 2021.
Por eso estamos aquí en FIA, para conocer estas nuevas compañías, estas nuevas MIPYMES.
It's still very new, but at least it looks very promising right now.
Pertenecer al sector privado es un gran reto en este país, que es un país que se está abriendo las oportunidades.
Los eventos donde se puede generar networking son muy necesarios para el emprendimiento cubano.
The U.S. embargo is one of the main obstacles for trade between Cuban and foreign businesses.
Y aunque estemos en el exterior, toda relación que tenga con Cuba, el bloqueo afecta.
Entorpece muchísimas negociaciones, a pesar de que incluso siendo nosotros una empresa extranjera, cuando hablas con productores, con empresas extranjeras, con bancos.
Afecta el tema financiero, afecta la posibilidad de que proveedores te puedan abastecer, afecta la posibilidad que te paguen adecuadamente.
Nosotros fuimos premiados con un financiamiento por el Hub de Innovación del Programa Mundial de Alimentos, con base en Colombia, y producto del bloqueo, cómo poder ejecutar ese financiamiento, cómo poder hacer uso de esa divisa sin tener una cuenta fuera de Cuba.
Si no existiera el bloqueo, la comercialización entre ambos países tuviera más fluidez.
You wouldn't have to be concerned about licenses, which products could be bought in the U.S.
Hubiese un flujo de comercio back and forth sin ningún tipo de situaciones.
Right. So, this is the irony.
I'm thinking a lot about the unimaginable situations families in Afghanistan.
So these are not people who are actually suffering, right? They're either Cuban American or foreign businessmen or Cuban entrepreneurs within Cuba, right, who are complaining about this embargo and blockade, right? So they're really aware of the impediments to the business, right, that they can do in Cuba. Whereas you saw Kilo, who really suffers. I mean, there's no running water in his house. There's intermittent electricity. You saw a little bit of the construction. It's very flimsy. When storms come around, the roof can blow off, right? They live in real poverty, but you can see his frustration, right? It's at the government, right? And again, I don't blame that at all, right? There's no reason why he should necessarily be aware, and there's no reason why he shouldn't blame the government either, right? I mean, certainly they could do a better job. But again, it's the blockade that exacerbates the situation so much. So I'm going to end now with this is the documentary on life tasks, the adaptation program adopted by the Cuban government several years ago. And so first, I'm just going to show a clip that explains what it is and what it's trying to do. And then I'm going to fast forward and just show you what is the major impediment to implementing this very innovative program.
What can we do to prepare for the damaging effects of climate change? Finding solutions is now essential. Cuba has come up with a 100-year plan to protect its population and environment, known as Tarea Vida.
Es un plan de acciones que cometen todos los organismos de la Administración Central del Estado y sus instituciones para la adaptación y la mitigación del cambio climático en correspondencia con lo que el país requiere y en cumplimiento de los convenios internacionales con la Convención Marco, con el Acuerdo de París. Coordinado por el SIGMA, o sea, el Ministerio de Ciencia, Tecnología y Medio Ambiente, que tiene papel de secretaría. Y la máxima responsable de esa secretaría es la ministra de Medio Ambiente, la compañera Elba Rosa Montoya. Pero adicionalmente, a nivel de las máximas autoridades del gobierno, se le presta una gran atención a este tema.
La Tarea Vida es la respuesta de política a la información científica de Cuba sobre el cambio climático. Desde el 2014 aproximadamente se volvió una práctica que todos los años se llevaba al gobierno la más reciente información científica, sobre todo sobre el ascenso del nivel medio del mar, porque para Cuba, como una gran isla, un archipiélago, pero como una isla principal, todo lo que tiene que ver con la zona costera es clave. Y en el 2016, en diciembre de 2016, el presidente indicó que esa información científica la trasladaran a una plataforma política para llevar a medidas ejecutables la implementación de la solución o la paliación de esos problemas climáticos.
Para Cuba es único y para el mundo no creo que haya muchos como plan de Estado. Todos los organismos del Estado cubano tenemos que dar respuestas con planes de acciones a corto, mediano, largo y muy largo plazo. Porque, por supuesto, los cambios en los fenómenos ambientales no se perciben con 1 año o 2 años de diferencia. Por eso se enmarcan cada 4 o 5 años estos periodos para poder evaluar realmente los efectos del cambio climático ante estas afectaciones en nuestro país.
Tarea Vida, se ha visto el plan de Estado, es un documento muy corto, porque es como una especie de plan sombrilla. que después se abre a los territorios y después va hasta los municipios. De hecho, hoy el peso mayor va estando en los municipios porque el propio proceso de gobernabilidad de Cuba está transitando por una descentralización donde el municipio adquiere un papel mayor. Y entonces allí se espera que se tomen las decisiones.
Existe una práctica a nivel del país que periódicamente el presidente de la República, punto.
Right, so I'm going to fast forward, and this will be the last. The principal obstacle to implementing the plan.
Otro reto fundamental es dentro de la ciencia, adquirir nuevas tecnologías que hoy existen para muchas de las acciones que hacemos, pero que evidentemente para Cuba, dado el propio bloqueo, están afectados fundamentalmente nuestros científicos. Muchas veces los resultados que pudiéramos dar en un periodo determinado se nos prolonga en el tiempo, y es precisamente por esta situación.
Usted pudiera en condiciones normales adquirir un equipo de alerta temprana en Estados Unidos. No puede hacerlo, tiene que ir a buscar a China, a Rusia o a otra latitudes. Con todo lo que implica en costos, tenemos limitaciones importantes en el acceso al financiamiento externo, en buena medida debido a la política de bloqueo. Un caso típico es que nosotros no podemos acceder a los bancos multilaterales de desarrollo. Dependemos de la cooperación bilateral, dependemos del sistema de Naciones Unidas, pero nuestras opciones son mucho más limitadas que las de cualquier país. Incluso accediendo a las fuentes en que conceptualmente podemos, porque no están limitadas por el bloqueo, internamente sí lo están, porque los eventuales socios para hacer actividades con Cuba también reciben las presiones del bloqueo, por si hace falta adquirir bienes o artículos que tienen que ver con Estados Unidos, tienen parte, tienen integrantes, ya entonces vuelven a regir las normas del bloqueo, y eso crea condiciones muy difíciles para la colaboración internacional. Incluso cuando acudimos a fondos que tienen que darnos esa financiación, como es el caso del Fondo Verde del Clima, en la más reciente votación del proyecto de Cuba que se aprobó en el mes de mayo en ese fondo, Estados Unidos se opuso al proyecto como parte de la misma.
Yo creo que el que hayamos podido acceder a los fondos, al Fondo Verde del Clima, yo creo que ha sido un paso de avance. El que hayamos podido acceder, que por primera vez Cuba tenga la posibilidad de acceder a esos fondos privados. En el caso específico de la Unión Europea, el acceso a los fondos tiene como una cierta flexibilización, ¿no? Pero realmente es como llamaríamos, la palabra no me gustaría, es como una guerra constante, ¿no? El poder acceder a los fondos, porque estamos realmente muy limitados para
hace ya más de 10.
Okay. Let me get back to this and.
Tres.
That's it. Thank you. So if you have any questions, comments, objections?
You want to feel the questions?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
One question on mine. From Mark B. Ginsburg, Mikael, can you mention and explain the impact of Cuba being placed on the U.S. State Department's list of state sponsors of terrorism?
Yeah. Thank you for that. I didn't even include that because I was looking more at the historical impact of the blockade through the late 2010s. But what Trump did right before he left office, after he tried, right, to stay in power. Remember, a self-coup, essentially. So the same guy who denies the election results and tries to stay in power points to Cuba and says it's undemocratic, and also sponsors terrorism. And Obama had taken Cuba off that list because there was no evidence of that whatsoever. All the intelligence agencies, CIA, corroborated this, and they still do. But yet Trump, in a really cruel act, at the very last minute, put Cuba back on this state-sponsored terrorism list. And what it does is it raises a red flag for just about any bank that lends money to Cuba, saying that this is too risky, right? you could be liable for all sorts of things if you are helping a terrorist state of some kind, right? So what it did was exacerbate the already existing blockade, right? It made it even harsher, even more difficult for Cuba to access funds, banks, multilateral lending banks, private banks, you name it. It's insidious. It's insidious because it's absolutely baseless. A journalist went and interviewed Democrats and Republicans in the intelligence agencies, and they said it's a joke. It's an absolute joke. Cuba does not know such thing. And yet, for political reasons, it's on that list. It makes life even harder for them. So taking them off that list would go a long way. It would just let them access at least some funds to repair desperately needed, infrastructure to help fund, their healthcare system, which used to be a very vaunted healthcare system. I mean, Cuba had amazing, statistics when it came to infant mortality, life expectancy, you name it, and the health of its population. That, unfortunately, now has really been taking a hit because of this crisis. They just can't access the medicines they need, the medical technologies. They have plenty of doctors, and as you might know, those doctors actually go on medical missions to other countries and serve populations that those countries' doctors don't even want to go. They'll go like up in the mountains and in rural areas. It's amazing. And I've talked to some of those doctors. They are incentivized to go. They get, by Cuban standards, they get a lot of money for doing this. But it's one thing to have doctors. It's another to have the medicines that the doctors prescribe, right? What can you do if you don't have the medicine? You can see a doctor, but if you don't get the medicine, well, what good is that, right? So that's also an effect of the blockade. And that would really be eased if Cuba got off of the state sponsor of terrorism list. That was low-hanging fruit that Biden could have done. A stroke of a pen. He has not done it yet. That's one of the main rallying cries of the movement and the blockade right now. It's just, that would be just the first step. Trump did this at the last minute when he was denying your win in the election. It was clearly cynical, had no basis, no backing. Why can't you just take Cuba off of that list? We're not asking you to do the heavy lifting of trying to get the whole embargo off, right? You still won't do it. Yeah.
Thank you, Mikael, for this talk. Really, really amazing, and the parallelism with climate change is really nice. I like the curve as it goes. When Russia collapsed and how it compares to what's happening with climate change. My question is, what is the United States afraid of, and how does the Guantanamo base, which is an imposed U.S. foot right there, what are these? Is there something that is connected? What is it afraid of, and what role does this Guantanamo Bay plays in this embargo or these policies?
Yeah. Thank you. Well, historically, the fear of a revolution like Cuba's had nothing to do with its defects, but with its virtues. That's the reality. You look at the documentary record, it's the model that it could provide for other countries, right? Of successful, independent development that prioritizes human needs. Now, you can criticize the way Castro did it, definitely. I have my criticism of Castro. I do think he was too authoritarian. I do think he could have held an election, in the first few years, he would have won it by 90%. But he didn't do that, But still, that is the main concern that you see in the documentary record. Has nothing to do with human rights. The United States was supporting Batista before him, right? Who was violating human rights left and right. When Castro came to power, you had, was it Baby or Papa Doc Duvalier in Haiti? Much worse dictator. Somoza in Nicaragua. Had nothing to do with that. Nothing to do with human rights. It was more like, wow, this revolution may actually nationalize U.S. properties, take back the resources, redistribute it to the people, a successful land reform. We can't have this. If that happens, then X, Y, Z country will think it can do this. That is, in a nutshell, really is the fear of, and we see it over and over again. This is the 50th anniversary of the coup against Allende. Allende was an even more of a threat because he won democratically. At least with Cuba, they can say, "Oh, this Castro guy, came to power with arms, and then he refused to hold an election." Well, Allende comes to power through democratic means, right? So that's even more of a threat. That guy has to go, right? I could go on and on and on. I mean, dozens of examples. In the Cold War, it was very clear because there was also the fear that these countries could then align with the Soviet bloc, right? And there was the Manichaean worldview of, we have to fight communism. But the thing is that communism was always kind of a cloak, right? Because a lot of these countries were never really communist as such, right? A lot of them were nationalist, were even democratic capitalist. But the main thing is they wanted to use resources for themselves, right? They wanted self-determination. They didn't want an economy dominated by U.S. companies. They didn't want to have to follow U.S. foreign policy. They wanted to be non-aligned or what have you. That was the main issue that the United States has had and continues to have with a lot of these countries. Cuba has maintained that independence at a very heavy cost. And so I don't think the model that it presents is what the United States fears anymore. Because clearly, if you go there, it's a terrible crisis right now. People don't have enough. There's shortages constantly. So that's not it. I think it's just this legacy of being so angry that this revolution happened right next door, right? And then you have this big diaspora of Cuban Americans, right there in Florida, who have a lock on this policy because of their electoral clout, right, in the electoral system. Florida used to be a swing state, meaning it would go Democrat or it would go Republican. And Republicans were not likely to change this policy. It usually fell on a Democrat to say, maybe we'll change it. But they had to think, but if I say that, I may lose Florida and its electoral votes. So I'm going to steer clear of that. And I'm just going to say what the Republicans say. No, Cuba, we have to punish it, blah, 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 right? But that doesn't even exist anymore now. Florida is clearly a red state. So this is where I'm not understanding where Biden's thinking is any longer. He's not going to win Florida next year. He doesn't even need to bother to campaign in Florida, right? He needs to focus on the Midwest with Midwestern states where he won in 2020. And a lot of those states want to do business with Cuba. They have agricultural industries that want to do business with Cuba. So I think this is kind of a combination of legacy, a kind of inertia, right? Caution, inertia. I don't know how else to explain it. And also the media coverage. Because anything that happens in Cuba, right, if there's a protest and there's a crackdown on it, it gets way more attention, right, happened in 2020, than the one in Colombia 2 months before. Right? I did a media study with my student, Jessica, if you're there. We published it. We went through Washington Post, New York Times, and the coverage of Cuba, first of all, was way more than in Colombia. Second, it was way more negative in Cuba's case than in Colombia's case. This is despite the fact that Colombia's crackdown was far worse than Cuba's. Far more people died in the crackdown in Colombia, right? But it didn't even get any U.S. media coverage for almost a week. Almost a week blackout in the U.S. Why? Because it was a right-wing ally, right? Cuba's still the sort of leftist, claiming to be socialist country, right? So I think that has a big effect. If the media covers it like this, it puts pressure on politicians, to denounce what's in the news, right? And I think that has a sort of self-reinforcing cycle, right? So that's my explanation. Now, it may be that if he wins a second term, he may say, okay, I guess I have the political capital now to spare and can go back to what Obama did.
And the Guantanamo.
Guantanamo, I don't actually think has much to do with this policy. It's a naval base that was imposed in about 1903, way before the revolution. It has a weird leasing mechanism and legal complexity. And I think it could be negotiated as part of a normalization package. And I think the irony is that normalization might actually mean that the US government gets to keep it by just paying Cuba money, and Cuba gets money out of it. Because that's been the model with other countries. That's the sad state of it. I mean, I would like to see it go. I mean, I don't think it has any purpose. It's been a big, horror chamber for a couple decades now. But I don't think it's such a sticking point. Of course, Cuba says, this is an imperialist imposition, it should go, blah, blah, blah. But I don't think Cuba is going to make it a big issue in a normalization. They want the embargo to go. That's what they want. Yeah. So as to what would happen to Guantanamo Bay, I really don't know as part of a normalization package. I got a feeling it's probably nothing, to be honest.
Thank you so much for this talk. I work on a completely different time period and set of objects, but I have a few questions based on your talk. So with the main premise of climate change denialism or climate change economic impact being comparable or could be beneficially compared to the embargo blockade, economic impact or denialism. I guess I had a question about the climate change comparison in particular, because denialism and sort of silencing of the negative impact of climate change seems to be just one of the many strategies in play. And I think that another one is kind of proposing these sort of false solutions, right? Like we just can plant 1 million trees and it's going to be fine, or electric cars are great, no worry, you don't need to worry about public transportation, or nuclear is actually great for the environment on the whole, and wind farms are actually bad. So I guess I was just wondering if I'm obviously more interested in sort of the rhetorical dimension than the economic one, but I'm just curious if it seems to me like a little bit of a difference, but I'm wondering if there's a broader range, perhaps, of, I can't imagine that there's a sort of the blockade is good for Cuba sort of argument, but if there's other parallels to this broad range of ways that climate change is not just silence, but there's also misinformation and distorted information and sort of false solutions that are proposed. And the other one, perhaps a bit of a naive sort of question, but you look at the economic impact as something that's comparable between climate change and the embargo and blockade. And I was just wondering about the metrics of human cost. I couldn't help but think in my mind of this conversation between Obama and Raul Castro, right, when Obama was expressing his concerns about human rights violations and especially freedom of expression, and Castro responded that in Cuba, free education, free health care, and equal pay were considered human rights, right? So there was a kind of competing metrics. So I'm interested in that. And then as a final comment, this image of the lion and the mouse is interesting, that when the mouse becomes useful because it can promises to cut through the netting that catches the mouse. I was just wondering if
catches the line.
If there's any actual parallels that come to mind for that, because I do think a little bit about COVID and the pandemic and moments when Cuban doctors and Cuban vaccine development is potentially or actually extremely useful. So I don't know. I'm just wondering if there's any sort of scenarios that could be considered.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So 3 questions.
Sorry, I'm sorry. You're all three out.
Definitely. I mean, I think the United States, that's the thing, could really make Cuba into an ally. I mean, on those issues, I think the main one is that it doesn't have any real resource to offer. Like, we're seeing a change with Venezuela right now, because Venezuela has oil, right? And so Biden's starting to ease sanctions on Venezuela. Unfortunately, Cuba really just doesn't even produce sugar anymore than it used to for centuries, right? And that's not really in demand the way it used to be. Now, its biotech industry is quite impressive, as we were talking about. Certainly, Americans would love to go visit Cuba much more easily. You actually can travel to Cuba, and you can actually go for tourism. If you want to know how, let me know. I have done it. I do it. Oops. State Department. I hope you're not watching. Or Treasury, whatever the OFAC office is. Yeah, so, it could, but I just don't think, Cuba compared with so many other countries just doesn't offer the U.S. a whole lot. There are individual business interests that absolutely want access to the Cuban market, agribusiness, all sorts, and you saw some of them in that video. But it's just not powerful enough of a lobby to be able to overcome the hardline, Cuban American lobby that just has this lock on it. So in that sense, I think it is kind of similar to the fossil fuel lobby, right? That for a long time had a real stranglehold on Congress, on both parties. Now really only the Republican Party. More and more Democrats have broken the fossil fuel industry because, like you say, renewable energy is actually becoming quite profitable. But you're right, there are all sorts of false solutions to climate change. So this is not a perfect comparison. It's a little bit apples and oranges, but there is another form of denial, which is to say that the embargo exists, but the United States exempts food and medicine, right, like for humanitarian reasons. And because it does that, in fact, there is a big trade with Cuba, and they'll cite a number like 260 million. Okay, here's the deal with that. First of all, it's very restricted what can go. Second, Cuba has to pay in cash fully for these. No other country has to do that. Every other country can do it on credit and gets usually help from the Export-Import Bank of the United States to do that. It's ridiculous to ask Cuba to pay all this fully in cash, especially when you know the country's bankrupt. Right? And in fact, U.S. producers complain about that all the time. We extend credit all the time to our customers. Why can't we do it to Cubans, for Cubans? No answer from the Biden administration, right? 260 million is a drop in the bucket of what it could be. I mean, to say 260 million in trade when it could be 26 billion, probably. The countries are right next to each other. Historically, the U.S. was Cuba's major trading partner and investor and so on and so forth. It could be way more than 260 million. So that's a really bad argument, right? So that might be a parallel to the sort of, bad solution kind of thing or false solution. I think you had another question in there.
The sort of competing metrics.
Oh, right. Okay, that's a great point. And I wanted to get to that. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 has two sets of rights, social, economic, and cultural rights, and then political and civil rights. The United States ignores, essentially, social, economic, and cultural rights. They're not codified in our Constitution. Only New Deal legislation in the 30s actually said we have a right to Social Security and things like that, right? And there's constant attacks on those social welfare measures that European states have codified as actual rights, right? And is part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Cuba absolutely says social, economic, and cultural rights. And they've largely delivered on those, not so much anymore because of the economic crisis. But for a very long time, they did deliver a lot on social, economic, and cultural rights. And they're absolutely right. Those are part of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But they didn't deliver so much on political and civil rights, true. Now, their reason for that is they're under siege, right? They have essentially a war against them. For a long time, it was actually a military war. There was a proxy invasion of the country. There was a threat to invade it when the Soviet Union put missiles there. And what got us out of a nuclear crisis was a pledge by the United States not to invade Cuba. So the Soviet Union took its missiles out. And since the United States has never actually sent its Marines to invade Cuba. But it still sent, or still allowed Cuban exiles to bomb, strafe, sabotage the country. And if you can imagine the U.S. reaction to 9/11, the Patriot Act, all sorts of restrictions on dissent. Even democracies will restrict dissent in times of war, right? I'm not excusing all of it by any means. I do think there's a problem in Cuba with censorship, with political expression. But as far as excuses or reasons go, the Cuban government has some pretty good ones, if you compare it to other countries, including democracies. But yes, historically, the United States has almost always ignored that half of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And it's that half that Cuba keeps saying, we deliver on this. And you can still go to Cuba and you'll see this. See, we provide free healthcare and education, and the United States doesn't do that. So how can they lecture us about violating human rights? So this, yeah, absolutely, it's been an ongoing sort of trade of barbs between the two countries. But to me, it's not even, it's not that important, because the United States doesn't really care about human rights in Cuba. I mean, if it did, why wouldn't it say anything about human rights violation in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia, in Uzbekistan, in Israel right now? You name it, right? There are human rights violations right here. Who is the United States to be lecturing Cuba about this? It's just pure hypocrisy, in my opinion. And I would just like that to be taken out until the United States applies a single universal standard for every country, including itself. Then let's talk about human rights, in Cuba. Go to Cuba, talk to Cubans about human rights. They have plenty to say about it, absolutely. I listen to them. I've heard all sorts of stories. I don't deny that there's a problem in Cuba about that. But that is not something for the United States to be taking up and using it as excuse to blockade the country. And by the way, a blockade is a human rights violation, is a huge human rights violation in and of itself. So, I don't know exactly what happened between Raul and Obama in that conversation, but anyway, I'm not surprised by it. Yeah. Are we done? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Wolfe, for that amazing presentation. This concludes our live stream for today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, may I make one plug before you turn off? So this was co-sponsored by the Cuba Observatory. It's a new program that's being rolled out here at the Center for Latin American Studies. Very excited about it. I'm the first director of it. And so look out for more programming, Cuba-related programming here on the campus. So this and last week's on the documentary screen were our first events. Thank you.